In 1975, a man named Roy Featherstone sat behind a desk at EMI Records in London and told the members of Queen that their music was too complex for radio and that Freddie Mercury's voice, specifically, was too operatic to reach a mainstream audience. This was not an unusual verdict. By the time EMI delivered it, Queen had been told variations of this sentence by most of the significant record labels in the British music industry. Decca had passed, RCA had passed, CBS had expressed interest and then gone quiet. The specific words changed from office to office, but the substance was the same. The voice is extraordinary, the music is interesting, but there is no commercial path here. Freddie Mercury heard this verdict. He had heard it before. And on a specific day in 1975, a day that Roy Featherstone would later describe as one of the defining moments of his career, Freddie Mercury sat across from the man who had said no and said nothing. He did not argue. He did not leave. He did not present a counterpoint or produce a sales figure or make a case in the conventional language of a musician trying to convince a label. He stood up. He walked to the center of the room. He asked the pianist who was present to stop playing, and then he sang, without accompaniment, without production, without the full Queen sound that the label had deemed uncommercial. Just the voice, in a room, for the man who had said the voice would not work. What happened next, Roy Featherstone has described in the specific terms of someone who witnessed something they did not fully understand at the time, and who has spent the decades since trying to find the right language for it. He has said the room changed. He has said, I understood in that moment that I had been measuring the wrong thing. By 1975, Queen had been a functioning band for 4 years. Their debut album in 1973 had displayed everything the industry would spend the next 2 years calling commercially problematic. The layered vocals, the orchestral guitar arrangements, the dramatic range of Freddie Mercury's voice across registers that had no obvious precedent in early 1970s radio formats. Queen, too, in 1974, had produced their first UK chart entry with 7 Seas of Rye. The momentum was building, slowly, but the label negotiations were going badly. The major labels had been approached and had found the numbers unconvincing. EMI was among the last significant doors that had not yet been closed. Roy Featherstone, who had developed a reputation for identifying talent others had missed, was the person Queen had been brought to see. Roy Featherstone's career at EMI had been built on the ability to hear what a piece of music was trying to do and evaluate that potential rather than simply measuring it against existing commercial success. When Queen was brought to his attention, he was not dismissive, he was interested. The music was clearly made with intelligence and ambition. The question was not whether Freddie Mercury was talented. The question was whether the talent was translatable into the formats that generated revenues. The 3-minute song, the immediately accessible melody, the vocal that worked within the compressed range of AM broadcast. Freddie Mercury's voice operated in a different register, entirely immersive, theatrical, demanding the full attention of the person hearing it. Whether that kind of listening could scale to the mass market was the question Featherstone was genuinely trying to answer. He was not trying to obstruct them. He was trying to understand something that the existing frameworks of commercial music evaluation were not built to evaluate. He was trying to understand something the existing frameworks were not built to evaluate. And Freddie Mercury, who had been told by every major label that his voice did not fit the framework, understood this. He had heard enough of the rejections to know that the problem was not talent. They all acknowledged the talent, but translation. The voice could not be translated into the formats they understood, and the formats they did not understand were the formats that could not generate the revenues that justified the investment. He had been making the case in the conventional language of the music industry for 2 years. The conventional language had not worked. And so in Roy Featherstone's office in 1975, Freddie Mercury changed the language. He did not ask Featherstone to reconsider the framework. He showed him what the framework had been missing. Queen had come in to make their case. The conventional part of the meeting had gone. As these meetings go, the music was played, the commercial concerns raised, and then at a point when the conventional part appeared to be concluding without the result Queen needed, Freddie Mercury asked for the room to be quietened. He asked the musicians present to stop, and then, with no accompaniment, with no production, with nothing between his voice and the people in the room he sang. The accounts of what he sang vary. What the accounts agree on is the quality of what happened. Roy Featherstone has described hearing Freddie Mercury's voice in that stripped-back context as different in kind from hearing it on recordings. The recordings had been filtered through the question of commercial viability. The voice in the room required no filter. It was simply what it was. And what it was, in Featherstone's account, was enough. More than enough. What Featherstone has said, consistently, is that the specific experience of hearing Freddie Mercury sing without accompaniment changed the nature of the evaluation he was conducting. He had been applying the framework of commercial radio viability to a voice that existed outside that framework, not because it was too extreme for radio, but because it was too complete. The voice did not need the production around it to communicate what it communicated. Freddie Mercury's voice reached listeners, directly bypassing the intermediary systems of attention management and landing in the room as a simple, irreducible fact. After the singing, Featherstone understood he had been measuring the wrong dimension. He had been asking whether the voice fit the format. The correct question was whether the format was large enough for the voice. The answer was clearly no. The correct commercial decision was to be the label that owned the voice while the format expanded. Queen signed with EMI in 1975. The deal gave Queen the creative latitude their music required. It gave EMI the commercial rights to a catalog that would within months include Bohemian Rhapsody. The song ran for nearly 6 minutes. It had multiple distinct movements, bearing no structural relationship to the 3-minute radio format. It had no chorus in the conventional sense. It was, by every measure that had been applied to Queen's music for 2 years, uncommercial. It reached #1 in the UK. It stayed there for 9 weeks. It became one of the most played songs in British radio history. The framework Featherstone had been applying was the same framework every other major label had applied. The difference was that Featherstone had, in a single afternoon, allowed the voice to show him what the framework had been missing. He had allowed the voice to show him what the framework had been missing. This is the specific form of what happened in Roy Featherstone's office in 1975. Not a performance in the theatrical sense, not Freddie Mercury demonstrating his talent as a piece of self-promotion. Something more like a correction, a quiet, direct, completely controlled demonstration of the thing that the frameworks had been failing to measure. He sang in a room. The room changed. A man who had said no found that he no longer had a reason to say no. And 9 months later, Bohemian Rhapsody was #1, and the voice that had been called uncommercial was being heard by more people than any other voice on British radio. And Roy Featherstone understood completely what he had understood incompletely in that office before the singing began. The 4 years before the EMI signing were not simply 4 years of rejection. They were 4 years of the specific education that comes from being told repeatedly that what you are doing is wrong by people professionally invested in understanding what is right. Brian May has described the period as one in which the band's conviction was both tested and deepened by every door that closed. Freddie Mercury emerged from those 4 years not diminished, but with a precise understanding of exactly what the industry thought was wrong with his voice, and exactly why those objections were measuring the wrong things. The shift that produced the Featherstone meeting, the decision to stop translating the voice into the language of commercial viability and simply let it speak in its own language, was the product of 4 years of learning exactly what the translation was failing to accomplish. The singing in the office was not an improvisation. It was the conclusion of a very long argument. The EMI story illuminates Freddie Mercury's self-knowledge, the precise, unsentimental understanding of what his voice was and what it required to be heard properly. The objection from the industry was not that the voice was bad. The objection was that it demanded a different kind of attention from commercial radio's convenience model. Commercial radio reached listeners who were doing other things. Freddie Mercury's voice required the listener to attend to make the specific decision to listen rather than receive. Freddie Mercury understood this distinction completely. What he demonstrated in Featherstone's office was that the solution was not to adjust the voice to fit the convenience framework. The solution was to create, in one small room, the conditions for the kind of attention his voice required and let Featherstone experience, directly, what happened when those conditions existed. Bohemian Rhapsody was released in October 1975. The story of its path to release the objections from within EMI, Kenny Everett's role in its initial exposure, the resistance to a nearly 6-minute single is one of the most documented stories in British popular music history. The song was everything Queen had been told was uncommercial, complex, operatic, structurally unconventional, demanding the listener's full attention. It worked not despite these qualities, but because of them. The listeners who found the song found it because it gave them something the convenience format had stopped providing: music that required and rewarded full attention. The 9 weeks at #1 were the commercial proof of the artistic argument Freddie Mercury had been making for 4 years. The voice was not too complex for radio. Radio had been too simple for the voice. Radio had been too simple for the voice. This is the reversal that the EMI story contains, and it is the reversal that Freddie Mercury understood before anyone else in the music industry understood it. And it is the reversal that he demonstrated to Roy Featherstone on the specific afternoon when he stood in a room and sang without accompaniment and let the voice make the argument that 4 years of conventional industry language had failed to make. He was not proving that his voice was good enough for the frameworks that existed. He was proving that the frameworks that existed were not large enough for the voice. And the commercial history of the next 15 years, the #1s, the sold-out stadiums, the radio plays that continued long after Freddie Mercury's death, was the extended proof of the argument he made in that room on one specific afternoon in 1975. Roy Featherstone continued at EMI through the late 1970s and 1980s, and the signing of Queen became one of the defining decisions of his career, not in the sense of his most commercially successful signing, but in the sense of the decision that most fully illustrated what he believed about the relationship between talent and commercial evaluation. He has said that the experience of hearing Freddie Mercury sing in that room was unlike any other listening experience in his professional life. He has said the quality of the voice, its completeness, its refusal to be reduced to any single evaluable element was something he had not had the framework to appreciate before it was demonstrated directly. He has not described the experience as a conversion. It was more like a correction. Understanding that a framework you have been applying accurately is nonetheless insufficient for the thing in front of you. The labels that rejected Queen were not making stupid decisions. They were making rational decisions within the frameworks they had available. The frameworks were wrong, not because the people applying them were incompetent, but because they had been built to evaluate a specific kind of commercial music, and Queen's music was a different kind. The quality that made Queen commercially problematic was the same quality that made them commercially enduring: the demand for full attention. Listeners who give their full attention to something and find it worthy do not add it to the background rotation of their lives. They keep it. They return to it. The commercial frameworks of the early 1970s could not measure durability because durability only becomes visible over time. What they could measure was immediate accessibility. Queen's music required something from the listener before giving the full return. The labels found the numbers insufficient. What they could not measure was what would happen once the accessibility had been established. What they were unable to measure was what would happen once the accessibility had been established. Bohemian Rhapsody established it in 9 weeks. The rest of Queen's commercial history was built on the foundation of that establishment. The listeners who gave their full attention to Bohemian Rhapsody and found it worthy of that attention kept it for the rest of their lives. They went to the concerts. They bought the albums. They told other people about it. They created the specific kind of commercial durability that is built on genuine connection rather than convenient availability. And the voice at the center of all of it was the same voice that Roy Featherstone had been told was uncommercial, the same voice that was too operatic, too complex, too demanding of the listener's attention to succeed in the formats that had been built for a different kind of music. The voice had not changed. The framework had been corrected. One afternoon in a room by a man who understood that the only way to demonstrate the inadequacy of the framework was to step outside it, Roy Featherstone sat behind a desk at EMI in 1975 and said no. Freddie Mercury did not argue. He stood up, asked for the musicians to stop, and sang, without accompaniment, without production, just the voice, in a room, for the man who had said the voice would not work. Featherstone has said, "I understood in that moment that I had been measuring the wrong thing." Queen signed with EMI. Bohemian Rhapsody was released 9 months later and went to #1 and stayed there for 9 weeks. The voice that had been called uncommercial became one of the most commercially successful voices of the 20th century. The framework had been wrong. The voice had been right. He stood up. He sang. The man who had said no changed his mind. Some arguments can only be made by singing them.